Welcome to the Otherweb. Our guest today is David Pinsof. Dr. Pinsof is an evolutionary social scientist at UCLA and one of the co-creators of the popular party game Cards Against Humanity. He is also known for deconstructing bullshit on his blog, Everything is Bullshit. David, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you on. So you have a blog about bullshit. Why?
Well, I think everything is bullshit, or nearly everything. We're surrounded by it. It's in our workplaces, in our homes, in our political lives, in our social lives, in our artistic lives, the media we consume, the stuff we read. It's really everywhere. You can't escape it. Which, of course, raises the question, what is bullshit? I think of it as a kind of negligence of the truth. It's different from lying. A liar actually has a certain kind of respect for the truth, or at least this was the claim made by the philosopher Harry Frankfurt in his book on bullshit. Perversely, the liar actually cares more about the truth than the bullshitter, because the liar actually knows what's true and knows that the truth matters and has consequences on the liar's reputation or livelihood. So the liar actually works hard to conceal and hide the truth. The bullshitter, on the other hand, couldn't care less about what's true. They just don't give a shit about what's true or insightful, what's accurate or explanatory, what's relevant to the goals of the person they're talking to. They're just trying to say whatever they need to say to get what they want. And what they want might be status, approval, sympathy, allegiance to their political tribe. It could be any number of things. But what they say is ultimately in service of that goal and not in service of the goal of accurately and insightfully describing reality to the person they're talking to. So I think of bullshit as a kind of epistemic negligence, a disregard for the truth. An interesting kind of bullshit is when we pretend to know or understand things that we really don't know or understand. I consider that a specific type of bullshitting that we see a lot. And because our social goals for status, sympathy, approval, whatever, often loom larger than our epistemic goals, that is, our goals to understand reality, well then, that means that the truth is going to lose out in a lot of different aspects of our lives. And so for that reason, I think that bullshit is extremely ubiquitous, common, and important. And that's why I try to understand it on my blog.
That's awesome. Let's try to analyze it in different contexts and see if there's any variance between them. So let's start with one-on-one. Do you see any variation in cultural, perhaps, variance between the way people speak in different places? I know that one of the things that struck me when I got to the US 16 years ago is how many conversations feel like the other person is telling me what they think I want to hear. And it almost takes effort to pull their opinion out of them. And I'm not even talking about fact or fiction. I'm just talking about what do you actually think? It's really hard. Whereas you go to Israel, they tell you what they think without you even asking for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting question where cultural variation in bullshitting tendencies comes from. I do think that in advanced Western democracies, bullshit takes a different form than it takes in perhaps less developed less market integrated societies. And I think the reason that's true is because bullshit is itself a commodity. We buy and sell bullshit in various forms. The media we consume, the stories we read, the things we watch. You could think of this as a kind of bullshit market. These are all different narratives that are being sold to us, and we pick and choose among those bullshit narratives based on how well they flatter us, flatter our political tribes, make us look good, tell self-flattering stories about ourselves. And so when you have a market for bullshit, what you see over time is advances in the quality of what the market is selling. So you see better and better bullshit at lower and lower prices. And so for that reason, I think advanced Western capitalist democracies actually have extremely compelling, potent, and advanced forms of bullshit for particularly low prices. And oftentimes it's pretty much free. The bullshit you see on social media is basically free. And so we are flooded with extremely high quality bullshit to serve whatever agenda we're trying to serve. And so I think it's possible that for that reason, Westerners are a little bit more smooth talking than other members of cultures. They have access to a wider variety of pithy slogans and propaganda and narratives. And it's possible that people from other cultures, when they come here, are kind of in awe of just how sweet smelling our bullshit is, because it's been honed through many generations of market competition. So I have an essay where I explore this hypothesis called the weirdest bullshit in the world. The weird is an acronym for Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries. So that's one hypothesis that might explain some of this variation in bullshitting. It might just be that bullshit is just better in some places for the same reason that cars or air conditioners or other forms of technology are better in some places than in others.
It could be also the opposite, that Americans are kind of used to their own type of bullshit, and therefore they don't have a visceral reaction to it because it's been here all along. Whereas when I hear it, there's almost like a jolt, like, wait, this is not what a person is supposed to say. And it takes me a while to adjust to that. I've been here for 16 years. I still haven't quite adjusted. Now, there's another thing that you said there, which is that we have these grand bullshit narratives that have been honed through generations. That's almost a Yuval Noah Harari kind of idea of the stories we tell ourselves basically becoming the thing that drives reality. So is this bullshit inevitable? Is it necessary? Are we basically useless without it?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I'm a fan of Yuval Harari, and I like his idea there that we need these fictions to sustain our society, to sustain cooperation. I think that bullshit is not useless. It's not just some random excrescence. It has useful functions for us. We evolved to be good bullshitters because good bullshitters ultimately prevailed in competitions for status, power, and resources. So I think our bullshit is highly strategic and highly functional. We use it to cover up our ugly motives. There's an interesting paper showing that this idea of venting is actually a sophisticated form of bullshit, that we have this narrative that when we talk shit about our rivals, what we're doing is we're blowing off steam. We're releasing pressure within ourselves. It's sort of a metaphor from the 1800s that goes back to the steam engine. And so instead of saying I'm talking shit about my rivals, I say I need to vent. I need to get this off my chest. I need to blow off steam. And that allows me to cover up my darker motives and reframe what I'm doing in a more self-flattering way. And there's empirical research showing that people who talk shit but frame their shit talking as venting are actually viewed more positively than people who just come out and talk shit. And so I think we have tons of these different kinds of bullshitting strategies for covering up and reframing our uglier motives. And I talk about many different strategies on my blog. Perhaps the biggest one is our pursuit of happiness. I'd be happy to get into that if you'd like.
Sure. I want to get into that, but first, as you were saying this, I'm immediately thinking, but wait, people vent in a marriage too. What is the uglier motive of basically bad-mouthing your partner as venting?
Oh, well, I mean, bad-mouthing your partner.
But there's no motive here. That there's no actual upside, is there?
Well, there can be an upside in that it helps you to bargain and negotiate for better treatment in the relationship. But you don't want to come out and say, I'm bargaining with you for better treatment by, attacking your reputation and trying to convince you that you're a shittier person than you really are. We don't come out and say that. No, we say, I need to get this off my chest. And there's this pressure welling up inside me as if my brain was a steam engine.
So before we get to pursuit of happiness, I want to go into one more psychological element, which is self-bullshit. We tend to tell a lot of bullshit stories to ourselves and about ourselves. And I know that me personally, I almost have this odd quirk where everything has to be part of a narrative I told myself, which means I am sometimes backward compatible and consistent with stupid things I did in the past, just so that this bullshit narrative can survive a bit longer. Have you looked into this?
I love that idea. I've thought a lot about it. I have been working on a post about that phenomenon. It's similar to the idea of a web of lies, where you tell one lie and then you have to tell more lies that are consistent with the first lie until eventually you end up constructing this elaborate web of lies that are all mutually consistent with one another, and the whole thing just kind of gets out of control. I think the same thing happens with our bullshit. I think we weave webs of bullshit that constitute our life stories. If we make up a bullshit excuse for some kind of behavior, say I say that I'm venting to get something off my chest, well then things I do later on are going to have to be consistent with that bullshit excuse. I'm going to have to construct a whole narrative about how I have these impulses inside me that need to be released, and I might explain my other behaviors as, releasing these impulses or blowing off steam, when really that's not the actual explanation for my behavior. And for the same reason, if I say, the reason that I'm, working such long hours is because I'm pursuing happiness or fulfillment or self-actualization. If I make up that bullshit excuse, then I'm going to have to do other things that are consistent with that bullshit excuse. I'm going to have to behave in ways that show that I'm pursuing happiness and self-actualization or, self-care, whatever. So yeah, I agree with you that these bullshit narratives can sort of take on a life of their own as we live our lives. And that's an interesting topic I plan to explore on my blog.
What explains the situations in which it doesn't? Like a person tells themselves a bullshit story about how they're going to live a very healthy lifestyle, exercise every day, eat only what they're supposed to eat, and then whenever nobody else is looking, they eat a cookie. How do you live with that if you're not compatible with your own bullshit story?
It's a great question. I think, well, for one thing, that does happen a lot, and people do selfish things when no one's looking, and I think the reason they do it is because no one's looking. But ultimately, if they do behave better, I think it's because of the suspicion that somebody might be looking or somebody might find out at some point. And in some cases, we might even do the right thing as a way of accumulating good evidence of our good character. So in the same way that a defense attorney might eagerly seek out evidence for his client's innocence, we eagerly seek out evidence for our good moral character. And one of the strategies we might use is actually creating that evidence in the world. So if I'm nervous that other people might think I'm a bad person, or if I'm greedy or selfish, I might do things in the world that prove that narrative wrong. I might donate to charity to convince myself that I'm a good person, because then I'll be better able to convince other people that I'm a good person later on. If they accuse me of being selfish, I'll be like, oh no, I donated to charity last week. And I won't be lying. It'll be true. I really did. But the reason I donated to charity was ultimately to convince myself that I'm a good person so that I could more effectively convince other people that I'm a good person later on.
It's especially true if it's the kind of charity that ends up with your name on the building or on the door. I always look at that and I'm thinking, is this charity really? Because it seems like there was a different motive here. Yeah, I have to say another observation as to what you're saying is I interact a lot with military people as part of one of the companies that I work with. And what I'm noticing is that the more elite the warrior, the bigger the story that they believe in. Like generally speaking, once you get to special forces, Navy SEALs, these kind of people, they're not just thinking about how do I maximize the benefit for me tomorrow. They believe in some grand narrative. And this is why they're able to perform at that level and not eat the cookie. Like they don't face the same temptations us normies do, just because there's a bigger story that already overrode all of those cost-benefit considerations.
Yeah, no, that brings me to another topic that I've been really interested in, which is these sacred narratives that we tell ourselves. So I think the origin of these sacred narratives, the function they serve, relates to the fragility of our status games. So what do I mean by fragility? I mean that we all want status. It's a basic human need. Yet at the same time, we don't want to look like we want status. We negatively judge status seekers. We have words for them like social climber, vain, narcissistic, sycophantic, assholish even. So the challenge is we have to somehow seek status without revealing the fact that we're seeking status. Because if we reveal that fact, we'll look selfish, vain, insecure, petty, and will lose status. So there's a kind of paradox there in our status games, is that if we see them as status games, then they collapse and we start to lose status for playing them. So I think that might explain the function of these sacred narratives. I think they're designed to keep our status games from collapsing under the weight of mutual awareness of what is going on. And if you think about the strategic dynamics of that, the people who are highest up in the hierarchy, who are winning the status game, they have the biggest vested interest in protecting that status game from collapsing. So they're going to be the ones who are going to be most committed to the sacred narrative and most motivated to push it and convince other people that this sacred narrative is correct. And so that might explain the phenomenon you're talking about elite members of the armed services being most committed to the sacred narrative, because they have the biggest vested interest in protecting the status game that they're playing from collapsing. And you might expect the people who are embittered, who are belittled, who are neglected within that status game, who are frustrated and feel that they're not getting the status they deserve, you might expect them to be more cynical about the status games being played by the armed services. You might expect them to try to make that status game collapse and point out the self-serving and sinister motives of those at the top.
So your explanation of this phenomenon basically assumes that the success in passing the Crucible and passing Hell Week and all of these things came first, and the devout belief in the narrative came later to justify yourself as the winner. It feels like it should be the other way around, though. Know that whoever had the strongest belief was the most likely to pass the Crucible and Hell Week as a result.
Yeah, I think that's also possible and likely. So if you are most committed to the sacred cause or to the sacred narrative, people are going to be less likely to see you as vain and selfish and petty and narcissistic, right? You're going to more successfully gain status by looking like you don't care about status. And so I think that plays a role in it as well. The more motivated you are by the sacred cause, the higher your status will be. And the higher your status will be, the more motivated you'll be to protect the underlying sacred narrative.
Right. So hopefully we circled all the way back to seeking happiness, because we're talking about status game, we're talking about other things. I'm personally looking all around me, and I actually don't see people seeking happiness, at least not in any intelligible way. People seem to be seeking pleasure, which generally speaking doesn't bring them happiness. So what do you view as seeking happiness, and how are we supposed to do it? What are we actually doing?
Yeah, so my first post I wrote was called Happiness is Bullshit. And in that post, I make a pretty counterintuitive argument. The argument is that nobody actually wants to be happy. That's not one of our actual basic evolved motives. Because if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, it makes no sense to pursue happiness, because happiness is inside our brains. For whatever reason, our ancestors weren't happy enough. Evolution could have just tweaked the knobs on our happiness and made us happier. It wouldn't have given us a motive to pursue happiness, because we don't need to pursue it. It's in our heads. Evolution could just go ahead and tune up our happiness. So being motivated to seek out something inside our heads does not make any evolutionary sense. What makes evolutionary sense is being motivated to seek out things in the world that increase your fitness and avoid things in the world that decrease your fitness. So what are things that increase your fitness? Well, status is obviously one of the biggest ones for our hyper-social species, but there's also things like sex, resources, political power, friendship, good relationships, people who have your back, who are ready to help you when you're in need. So we have all these evolved goals that are centered around real things in the world, because those of our ancestors who pursued real things in the world would have left more descendants than those of our ancestors who were only concerned about vibes inside their head. And that's why we often make a distinction between vibes in our head and objective success in the world. And so I think what we want at the end of the day is objective success in the world and not vibes in our head. And when we're forced to choose between objective things in the world and vibes in our head, we go for the objective things in the world almost every time. So the argument I make is that because we don't actually want happiness and we pretend we do, that this whole narrative of the pursuit of happiness is a bullshit story we tell, often to cover up our more unflattering motives. So I'm not running the cancer marathon to show off how healthy and virtuous I am. I'm doing it because it's rewarding. It makes me feel happy inside. It's fulfilling. I'm not working long hours and climbing the corporate ladder to gain status in my career. I'm doing it because it's fulfilling to me. I'm making a difference. I'm pursuing self-actualization and trying to reach my full potential. These are the stories we tell to cover up our more unflattering motives. But at the end of the day, I don't think happiness is the thing we're seeking. I think it's something else, and I'd be happy to get into what I think it is.
I actually want to get into that a little bit because it seems to me like the actual things in the world, as you describe them, are also no longer connected to our fitness or survival or reproductive capacity. So how high we climb up the social ladder doesn't actually cause more of our children to survive into adulthood anymore. And so is that more important than happiness? Less important? Is pleasure more important than both of these? It seems like the hedonists seem to think that is the case. What are we actually playing here?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we're not pursuing fitness directly because fitness is an abstract property. It's your genetic representation in future generations. And it doesn't make sense to have a direct motive for fitness because the whole point of having a motive is to pursue that motive in the world and learn through feedback what works in achieving that motive and what doesn't. But you can't act in the world to increase your fitness and get feedback on what's working for your fitness and what's not, because by the time you learn whether you've got high fitness or not, you're already dead, right? Fitness is a property of future generations. It's not something that's happening right now. So there's no way to directly seek fitness in the world. The best that we can do as evolved organisms is seek proxies of fitness, seek the things that reliably correlated with fitness in ancestral environments. Those things may not be correlated with fitness in modern environments. And in fact, probably a lot of them are not. This is known as evolutionary mismatch. The best example of this would be our taste for junk foods. So the reason why we love fatty, sweet foods that are unhealthy for us is because those foods were very scarce in ancestral environments. And so we evolved to prioritize and especially savor those rare treats. But now in modern environments, they are abundant, and that desire for sweet, fatty foods is no longer serving us. So that would be a case of mismatch. But I would maintain that what we want is those fitness proxies and not happiness itself. We want the status, we want the junk food, we want the sex. Even if it's not increasing our fitness in modern environments, we still want it, and we don't want happiness.
This was my next question, which is it seems like we're actually pursuing the proxy of a proxy and not the first level one. Because if you take sex as an example, we're not pursuing sex. We're not even pursuing reproduction, right? What we're pursuing is the pleasure of sex, which might happen with birth control or with ourselves, in which case there is no reproductive value.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, we're pursuing, I wouldn't say that we're pursuing the pleasure from sex. I still think we want the sex itself, which is why we prefer to have sex over masturbating. If all we wanted was the pleasure of the orgasm, we would just masturbate all day.
In some countries, that is already the case. If you look at stats from Japan, South Korea, etc., it could be that that's what the human race is evolving into.
It's possible. I don't think it's very likely, though. I think that if you actually ask people if they prefer to have sex with an attractive partner versus masturbate, I bet you 99% of people would obviously choose the sex. So I don't think that people are masturbating in place of sex that they could otherwise be having. I think probably what's happening is, for whatever reason, there just aren't sexual opportunities available. So it's an interesting question. Why sex is more common or less common in some places than in other places. But I would be skeptical of the idea that masturbation is replacing it.
I didn't look into the data that deeply. Obviously, that's not exactly my area of research. But it seems to me like the difference is not between places. It is just between points in the timeline. Like Japan and South Korea are just ahead of most Western countries in where the trend is leading, which is that fewer and fewer people, especially young males, are interested in sex with other people at all. That trend line has been going in one direction. And in the United States, it's also going in the same direction. We're just a few decades behind, maybe because we got crazy porn a bit later.
It's possible. Yeah, it's a really fascinating and puzzling phenomenon. I'm not sure I have a good explanation for it. I'd be interested in reading more about it and thinking more about it.
So let's then go back to other more mundane types of pursuing happiness. I think there's some indication that when the Declaration of Independence was written, the word happiness was essentially a substitute for property in there. So I think maybe that is what we're really seeking as a form of status or something that increases our survival. What do you think about that?
That's interesting. Yeah, that's very consistent with the argument that maybe it was too unflattering to come out and say pursuit of property, and so we replaced it with happiness as a more nice sounding, flattering thing to put in the Constitution. That would be very fitting to my story.
Bear in mind, John Locke talked mostly about property in that sense. And then if you look at the European variant of human rights, then basically Montesquieu's rights are life, liberty, and property, right? The Declaration is kind of unique in that it says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and doesn't mention property. Everybody else that precedes it did. So that's kind of the theory.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I'll have to look more into that. That's a fascinating example. Our very nation is founded on bullshit happiness.
All right, so let's get into the political, because I know that you've studied this quite a bit. Obviously, politicians are known for bullshitting quite a bit.
No, really? Politicians? Come on, they always tell the truth,
outsiders
right?
That say they are not politicians, but claim to continue to be outsiders even 8 years later, especially so. How does that work in that particular market? Because that's mass bullshit. It's a bit more complex. You're now supposed to say bullshit that a lot of people who disagree with each other still believe at the same time.
Yeah, no, politics is really interesting and paradoxical. The game that politicians have to play is to say whatever their constituents want to hear, while concealing the fact that they're saying whatever their constituents want to hear, because their constituents don't want to be told what they want to hear. They want to be told, a nice story about what's best for the country or what's making the world a better place or whatever. And so politicians have to jump through a lot of hoops to do this balancing act where they have to, flagrantly flatter and cater to their constituents to gain power and to get elected, while concealing the fact that what they're doing is ultimately, flattering and catering to their constituents and changing their opinions whenever their political needs change and different factions gain prominence within their coalitions. It's a fascinating phenomenon. But at the end of the day, I think politicians are motivated to gain power. That's their job. They're motivated to maintain power. Maintaining power means keeping their jobs. And to do that, you need to rally a coalition of supporters. And in order to rally a coalition of supporters, you need to say things that they like. And you need to not say things that they don't like. And when your coalition is changing and different factions are rising to prominence, you need to change your opinions to maintain power. That's the game that politicians play. And it's also, to some extent, the game that we as voters play. Just as politicians try to mobilize a coalition to gain power, members of that coalition also want power. They gain power by being a member of that winning coalition. And so they're motivated to tell whatever stories serve the interests of the coalition just as much as politicians are. And so they often change their tune when the electoral dynamics change, when the coalitions change, just as much as politicians do. There's tons of political science literature on this, where people will support one policy when they're told that their party supports it, and then they'll oppose that policy when they're told that their party opposes it. They're basically just following the leader. They're following the tribe. There are some exceptions to this. I think there are some core issues that people feel strongly about, but for a large percentage of them, people are just following the tribe. And so I think that is largely responsible for the contents of our political belief systems. If you look at the particular members of each political coalition and what kinds of narratives serve each faction within that coalition, and then put all those factions together, well, you get our political beliefs. So I have a post called What Are Ideologies All About that looks at some of the puzzling inconsistencies and double standards in political belief systems and tries to connect them to the heterogeneity of our political coalitions. That saying one thing or appealing to one kind of moral principle might work when you're rallying support for, say, evangelical Christians or African Americans, but that principle might not work when you apply it to, say, Southerners or atheists. And so when you change the particular group in question, people often change their moral principles to serve that group or oppose that group.
Sometimes even things much more mundane than principles. If you look at immigration as a sacred value of the left versus immigration as it pertains to labor rights, typically labor unions were against immigration because they lowered their wages and lowered their bargaining power. And so within the same coalition here, that's obviously a big contradiction in what they're supposed to seek. I had one question to you, which is, it seems to me that not only is there a lot of bullshit in politics, but there is counter bullshit. And you see this with left and right. You alluded to this. If the left announces one belief, the right tends to just rush to the exact opposite, whether it makes any sense or not. But we're also seeing mainstream beliefs versus counter-narrative beliefs or fringe beliefs that then occur on both the left and right simultaneously. And almost like there's a horseshoe where the fringes of both parties meet, in that the only thing they can agree on is that they don't like the guys in the center because they have too much power. So they end up believing the exact opposite.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So contrary to the conventional wisdom, it's actually only a small percentage of Americans and of people in general that are, truly committed to their party and gung-ho about it, and politically extreme in their views and filled with hatred for the other side. Most Americans are actually pretty disillusioned with politics. They don't really care that much one way or the other. They don't really have consistent ideologies. Many of them don't vote consistently. So the majority of people in the country are actually not true believers or gung-ho for one side or the other. It's really just the fringes that are gung-ho. And unfortunately, it's the fringes that we hear from the most. They're the ones who are writing the op-eds, who are making the media that we consume. And so it creates the illusion that we live in a divided nation where there are these two sides that hate each other and they're believing increasingly ridiculous things. But in fact, most Americans are pretty, commonsensical. They don't really feel that strongly one way or the other. They're, open to some ideas over others. And so what's interesting is that those folks have become increasingly fed up with politics because they see so much poisonous rhetoric on both sides of the aisle, and they just don't want to be a part of it all. They just disengage. And so that might be what you're talking about with this kind of counter bullshitting that we're starting to increasingly see as people get fed up with this dynamic.
Well, I'm also seeing, again, because I tend to observe different countries, I see that in the US, there is a much more reactionary tendency with regards to everything from vaccines to supporting Ukraine to any other topic. If the mainstream tends to pick a particular position, fringes on both sides are going to pick the opposite position, even if it makes no sense and they have to twist themselves into pretzels to support that level of bullshit, right? And you don't see this in other countries to the same extent. I know that, again, with regards to vaccines, I would just look at the discussion in Israel, in Norway, in Denmark, in Finland. I wouldn't see that there's even another side in the discussion. Pretty much everybody was actually following some sort of mainstream data. And here, really quickly, left picked a side. The right reacted to that by going far away into the opposite. The left, in reaction to the right, started distancing itself from the center. And now you don't just wear a mask, you double mask, you leave your kids at home, no school, nothing, right? And just everybody pushed themselves into this odd corner that makes no sense because what they're following isn't the original bullshit. It's counter bullshit to the other side's counter bullshit.
Yeah, no, that's a really excellent point and excellent example. I do think that polarization is higher in the US than it is in some other countries. And that might explain the toxic dynamic that you just described. Why the US is more polarized than other countries is an interesting question. I think part of the answer is that we've seen more sorting and more alignment within coalitions. This is an argument that the political scientist Liliana Mason has made. And she argues that increasingly our group identities have sorted such that If you're a Christian, then you're also probably likely to live in a small town and likely to be Southern and likely to be white and likely to be a business owner and not have a college degree. That all of these identities have sort of become more and more intercorrelated over time. And the same thing goes on the left. If you're urban, then you're probably less likely to be religious. You're more likely to have gone to college, et cetera. So what has happened is there used to be more cross-cutting identities, where there used to be more Christian Democrats and more highly educated Republicans. But over time, what has happened is, we've become polarized over education. So highly educated people have moved to the Democratic Party, and that caused a corresponding backlash where, the less educated people moved toward the Republican Party. So now we're polarized along that dimension. We've polarized more over certain sexual and religious issues surrounding abortion and gay marriage. And so what has happened is we have these two mega identities that sort of subsume everything. And so that's one explanation for why America is more polarized than other countries.
So let's look into another possible explanation that perhaps followed the exact same trend, but the US is probably one of the only countries where the media sources have sorted themselves in the same way. And so the left and the right no longer consume the same media either, because media outlets have sorted themselves into left of center or right of center. And since we're talking about bullshit, we have to talk about the media. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's plausible as well. And they could interact with one another. So insofar as we've seen more education polarization and journalists are more educated than non-journalists, well, then you're going to see a leftward skew among journalism and in the media. And that in turn creates a wave of distrust and disillusionment of the establishment of experts and intellectuals among the Republican Party, which is what we're seeing. And so we get this toxic dynamic where the intelligentsia has increasingly moved to the left. And that has caused a backlash on the right where they're skeptical and distrustful of all forms of expert knowledge, of a lot of scientific evidence, of mainstream academic research, and of the establishment and the system in general. And so this is a very bad thing for democracy. I hope that this kind of educational sorting ends soon and we see a different coalition arising. But right now, it's very bad for us.
Yeah, and with the media specifically, this is my day job, right? Otherweb is a news aggregator. And so I'm seeing a lot of not just bullshit, but there's a lot of discussion about misinformation and things like that, couched in really high-minded language, right? And everybody always suspects that there's a nefarious actor somewhere on the other side producing this particular type of bullshit. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, wait, in 2016, the most shared story on Facebook was the Pope endorses Donald Trump, 800,000 shares. That was produced by 3 kids in Macedonia who made a lot of money based on that story. And they had the 5 out of the top 10 stories for that year on Facebook. And so clearly that was not a nefarious actor somewhere trying to convince you of something. They were just making money. So it wasn't misinformation, disinformation. It was just pure junk, right? Something that is just there to make clicks. This seems to be the majority of our ecosystem, no?
Yeah, I would agree in general. I think the misinformation narrative, the misinformation panic, is itself, ironically, a kind of misinformation. The philosopher Dan Williams has written a lot about the misinformation panic. And the argument he makes is that depending on how you define misinformation, it's basically not a serious issue. If you define it as fabricated news, as strictly false news, then it's actually very rare, very uncommon. And it doesn't actually change anyone's mind. It's basically just consumed by people who are, looking for evidence to bolster their side. It's preaching to the choir. It's not really having that much of a direct influence on people's political identities or decision making. It's just a kind of, tabloid entertainment for gung-ho tribalists. But if you define it more broadly as misleading content, perhaps omitting certain truths or bending certain truths or selectively citing certain kinds of evidence while omitting certain kinds of evidence, if you define it that way, then it's too broad. Then it basically encompasses the entire media landscape on both the left and the right. And it becomes increasingly difficult to determine what counts as misinformation and what doesn't. And inevitably, people are going to be biased about what counts as misinformation. And if it's mostly left-wing people who are studying misinformation and doing this research, well, they're obviously going to define misinformation in self-serving ways. They're going to define any misleading content on the right as misinformation, and they're going to ignore any misleading content on the left. And that's basically what you've seen in a lot of misinformation research. And if you're more interested in this topic, I'd recommend the philosopher Dan Williams' Substack, Conspicuous Cognition. He has a lot of excellent posts on this topic.
Yeah, I'll definitely check him out. My impression is that there's a third level to this, which is just leaving aside the content of what people are saying, because that doesn't matter, right? What matters is you have a single selective pressure, maximizing clicks and views. And so regardless of the intentions of the actors, evolution happens. And these memes just drift towards clickbait over time. And so everything gets filled with random things that are really good and tuned to make people click. And sometimes the Pope endorses Donald Trump, and sometimes 12-foot giants are roaming Iran, right? It doesn't matter what it is. Whatever makes people click wins.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the problem is that like either misinformation is everywhere or it's nowhere. And either way, it's different from the story we're being told.
I would caution people to consider that disinformation, right, the intentional fabricated stories, does exist, and it sometimes does have an effect. Like, as incompetent as Russia is in most things, they are pretty good at this, and you're seeing certain local effects of this. I can point to specific people in the US that for some reason keep repeating things that have only appeared in the Russian press before that, right? So that effect exists. It's not very prevalent, but certainly I see it, right? I'm seeing, again, with following the Russian example, there have been stories in the past that have been entirely fabricated, but actually riled up a community to act in some way. There was a story fabricated in the Russian-speaking press in Germany about a Russian girl named Lisa that was supposedly raped by Muslim migrants. And they actually had groups of Russian speakers that get together and go to the Muslim quarter and try to pick fights with people, or trying to find Lisa or figure out who harmed her, right? And obviously that girl never existed. So local effects like this exist. Are they more numerous than just the random junk we're seeing? Obviously not.
You know, that's a really important caveat. That I'm not saying that these kinds of fabricated news stories don't exist at all and don't have any effect at all. I'm making the more nuanced claim that it's overrated, that this is not the number one problem facing America or facing the world. It is a relatively minor problem compared to our other problems, and it is not new. It's not like this only came on the scene with the advent of social media. People have been making up shit for centuries and millennia, right? And there's no evidence to suggest that we're making up more shit now than we used to make up in previous eras. So for that reason, I'm skeptical of the particular narrative that misinformation is big, important, and new. I think it is smaller than we think, less significant than we think, and certainly less new than we think.
Right. So that sounds like a very hopeful note. But I also want to look towards the future. You've given us a diagnosis of the world around us. What is the best possible prognosis? How does this improve over time?
The best possible prognosis is that seeing through bullshit is good for us, and that as we see through more of it, the world gets better. As we see through the self-serving virtue signals, that will create an incentive for people to send better virtue signals, to do more effective forms of altruism, to escape the character attacks of anti-bullshitters like me. And that will lead to more effective altruism and more good in the world. So I think that is one way in which calling out people's bullshit can actually lead to positive change, especially when you consider the fact that bullshit is often used for nefarious, tribal, or self-serving purposes. Calling out that bullshit can hinder those toxic forces. You pointed out a really great example of how the debate over COVID polarized us and allowed us to get into this toxic debate where it was more about signaling which side you were on than about actually discussing what policies made the most sense from a sort of dispassionate cost-benefit analysis. I think calling bullshit on that type of thing is good because we want less of that type of thing. We want more dispassionate, nuanced cost-benefit analysis of the policies that affect the entire world. And so I think there is some sliver of hope in this cynical way of thinking, and that it will lead us to be better people and better societies.
David Pinsof, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.